Today we are learning Eruvin Daf Zayin, Shavua Tov, and good morning to everybody. We are going to start at the very top of the daf, but I'm just going to quickly review. We're in the middle of one of these really, really interesting sugyot. Okay, if you're, some people are loving the architectural structures of Eruvin. Some people are finding it a little bit complicated. What's nice here is that both in today's daf, and we're going to get to this on Yud Gimel also, which comes up next Shabbat, some very famous sugyot which deal with the importance of, or the concept of, on the one hand, we have many different opinions. Actually, the sugya of Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim comes up on Eruvin Daf Yud Gimel, which is, right, everybody's Torah, the way they read it is the truth. However, we paskin like Beit Hillel, okay? And that's going to be the struggle here, which is, on the one hand, we have this idea of pluralism in Judaism, and there's a lot of room for all different opinions, and that they're all, so to speak, truth, or if they're not absolute truth, at least they're relative truth. On the other hand, with that, we have this concept that, well, there is one right answer. So there's this big struggle, and that's exactly what this sugya is struggling with. Okay, I'll remind you where we started. We were learning about what a mavoi mefulash is, a mavoi that's open on both sides, and there was a machloket about what we do with a mavoi that's open on both sides. We had Tanakama on the one hand who said you need a tzurat petach on one side, right, meaning a cross beam going, right, a beam going across, and two posts on the side. Someone corrected me that that's a better way to say it. A lechi is a post, which is standing vertically, and a beam is a horizontal beam, so I'll use those words now. Going forward. So you need both the beam and the two posts on one side, and a lechi and a korah on the other, although there was a bit of a girsa problem. Is it both, or it seems really probably only one? And then we had Hananya, who according to Beit Hillel said, right, remember Hananya said, machloket Beit Shammai, Beit Shammai, you need all the doors locked all the time. But according to Beit Hillel, you need a door on one side. It's not enough just to have a tzurat petach. You need a door on one side and a lechi or a korah on the other side. So that was one machloket. One machloket we had, Rav paskin, that we hold like Tanakama and had the more lenient opinion, and Shmuel paskin that we hold that you actually need a door on one side like Beit Hillel. Then we had another machloket, which is that's a mavoi mefulash, that's open on both sides. Then we had a whole question, what happens when you have a mavoi akum, which is an L-shaped mavoi, where it's not open on both sides, that you look in one and you can see the exit on the other side, but it turns and it has two openings, but on either side, not opposite each other. And then in that case, we said that Shmuel was more lenient there and viewed this as a closed mavoi that basically doesn't need this extra, the door, according to Shmuel. But Rav said a mavoi akum is viewed like a mavoi mefulash, and then you would need to fix it with a tzurat petach and a lechi and a korah. However, there was this case where there was a mavoi akum in Nahar Deah, and there was a debate among Rashi and Tosfot exactly what this looked like. Was it a U-shaped or chet-shaped in Hebrew, or was it something else maybe according to Tosfot? But whichever way they viewed this mavoi akum, they paskin like Rav that it needed that we treat it as a mavoi mefulash, as an open mavoi, and they did like Shmuel, that needed not only a tzurat petach, but also you needed a delet, you needed a door on one side. So we tried to figure out, how did they put the chumrot of Rav and the chumrot of Shmuel when we have this saying that says that, and then it started and it said a bunch more things than we were really asking for. But the bottom line for right now, and then I'll get to the other parts, is that you can't take the chumrot of two positions. If you're going to go like one person, you have to go like him all the way. Take his kulot, take his chumrot, take his leniencies and his stringencies. Don't say, I'm going to take the leniencies of both. You're a rasha, you're a bad person because you're just looking for the easy way out. And even taking the stringencies of both is a problem because haksiel b'choshech holech. And we'll get back to this later, but it really sounds like you're walking in the dark. Why are you walking in the dark? Because you're not making any sense what you're doing, because you're almost like taking some sort of contradiction, and we'll get back to this later. But then there was another problem in this whole thing, which goes back to this idea of, on the one hand, there's many opinions, and they all have truth to them. On the other hand, we have to decide in the end who we hold like. So we have this issue that the beginning of the Braita, before we get to the answer to our question, the beginning of the Braita said, we always hold like Beit Hillel against Beit Shammai. However, if you want to go like Beit Shammai, you can. To which the Gemara said, what are you talking about? If we hold like Beit Hillel, you can't just go like Beit Shammai. So we brought two answers, and now we're going to see the third. But the first answer, just to review, was really one is to say it was said before the heavenly voice came down, deciding that the halacha is like Beit Hillel, and there was at some point a heavenly voice came down and said the halacha is like Beit Hillel, and from there we knew that the halacha is like Beit Hillel. We'll get to this when we get to Eruvin Daf Yomi. Or we say, and then basically before it was decided, you can do whatever you want. Once it's decided, you really can't anymore. The second option was to say, maybe it holds like Rabbi Yeshua, this bright, and Rabbi Yeshua says, we don't hold by heavenly voices. Right? That's the famous Lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in the heavens. The Torah was given to man. We don't believe in heavenly voices that come down and tell us. It comes from the famous story of Rabbi Elazar ben Hyrcanus, where the heavenly voice came down and basically made it very clear that he was right, but the rabbis disagreed with him, didn't understand his opinion, and therefore they didn't hold like him. So that's a second option. And the third option we're going to see right now inside second line of our daf of Zayin Amud Aleph, Ibait ema hachi kama. Some people say this is what we say. This is what it says. The Braita doesn't read the way we thought it read. The Braita should be read like this. Kol hecha de mishkacha trei tenai utrei amorai de plige hadade ke'en machloket Beit Shammai u Beit Hillel. In other words, this didn't mean if you want, you could do like Beit Shammai. No, this was actually not referring to Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. This is referring to any two Tanaim who debate an issue, or two Amoraim who debate an issue like Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel debated, because they're the most famous ones that we know about all their debates. So anyone who argues about a topic like them, lo la'avi kekule demar v'chi kekule demar, v'lo kechumrei demar v'lo kechumrei demar. Don't hold like, and don't take two opposite positions, basically. Don't hold like this one for the kulas and this one for the, right? Both for the leniencies or both for the stringencies. Ela o kekule demar, o kechumrei demar, o kekule demar, o kechumrei avid. In other words, pick one position. Right? This is like we say, kinei lecha rav. Choose a Rav and go with that Rav in general. Don't say, oh, I'm going to pick and choose. So that's what it means, which means that really when it's said in the beginning, okay, again, you have to read it from the beginning and reread it because this definitely isn't the pshat of that source. The halacha is always like Beit Hillel. But if you had another machloket that was like Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel where it wasn't so clear cut who we hold by, then then if you want to choose one side over the other, you can choose. But not in Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, because there it's very clear that we hold like Beit Hillel. And again, the reason why we hold like Beit Hillel we'll get to on Eruvin Daf Yomi, so hold off a few more days. But that's the case here. So then we're not, according to this third answer, really the topic isn't Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. It's really talking about other arguments between people. Anyway, that wasn't really why we brought this up. So now we'll get back to why we brought it up. And the Gemara reminds us, Umikoma kom kashya. But even if we explain it that way, we still have a problem. What's our problem? Our problem is, how do we hold like the two positions of Rav and Shmuel, each lechumra? We can't take the stringency of one, the stringency of the other. Again, the stringency of Rav that we're going to call a mavoy akum, a mavoy mefulash, an open mavoy that needs extra things. And then what does it need extra? Well, let's take Shmuel's definition and make you put a door on one side. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, we're going to have two different answers here. His answer is, Kulei ki Rav avdua. Really, he wasn't taking stringency of two positions. He was holding like Rav. Well, how could he be holding like Rav? Rav says you don't need a door. You just need a tzurata petach. Well, let's read. To Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, halacha ve'ein morin kain. It is a fascinating daf because what we're really getting at is, how do we paskin halacha? Number one, right? How do you choose who you're going to hold? Like, can you choose by, are you allowed to choose against, let's say, a decision that was made that we hold like him? Or are you allowed to hold by somebody else? All these kind of issues. Now we're going to learn that sometimes when people hold a position, they don't necessarily teach their position. Rav thought that the law should be surata petach on one side, lechi or korah on the other side, and that's enough. However, he didn't want to teach that way. Meaning Rav himself was more stringent than what he thought. And this happens very often, that they might think theoretically something's okay, but what are they worried? That if we allow that, people might come to allow other things. And right, we keep talking about this, putting up fences around the Torah. And even though he held this way in theory, he didn't hold that way in practice. Ein morin ke means you don't teach the general people to do this. Now, you might teach in the Beit Midrash, this is the explanation, But when it comes to halacha l'maaseh, you teach something else. In which case, he wasn't taking the stringency of Rav and the stringency of Shmuel. He was basically holding like Rav all the way. And that's why they ruled in this Mavoi Akum that you needed a door on one side, because even Rav agreed with that. So that's one option. And that's, according to Rav Huna, Rav held that you don't teach this way. And therefore, he was more stringent on himself. However, the second option is Rav Ada bar Ava Amar Rav. However, Rav Ada bar Ava taught in the name of Rav, the Amar Halacha Umorim came. We do teach this way. So Rav really held that you don't need a door. In which case, we're back to square one. According to him, what do we answer? Ma'ika l'meimar, what can we say? Because again, it's stringencies of both opinions, which you can't do. Well, now we're going to limit that whole concept that you can't hold by the stringencies of two positions to particular cases, to certain criteria. It's not going to apply across the board. Okay? Now, what are we going to say? Amar Rav Shizbi, Kilo avdinan kechumre debeitre. The case is when we don't hold like both is only hecha desatre hadade, when they contradict each other. When holding by this, and this is why it makes sense with the verse. The verse said, "Haksil b'chosha cholech." That means, right, a not wise person, a person doesn't, I don't know, I don't like to use the word stupid, but kind of someone, a foolish person, I guess is a better translation. A foolish person will walk in the dark. Meaning, if you take two stringencies that contradict each other, well, then you're basically walking in the dark because you don't understand anything. You're basically saying, this is true in one case, not true in the other. We're going to see now a situation where that is the case. So let's read. Kigon shidra v'gulgolet, like a spine and a skull. Okay, these are parts of a body of a person. Let's assume they died. If they die and the part of a body, okay, if you have a whole part of a body of a person in a tent or a house, then that carries tumat oel, and that's going to be mitame, everything in the house. So now we're going to say, what happens if it's not whole? What makes it not whole? How much needs to be missing in order for it to be not whole? So here we have a machloket Beit Shammai Beit Hillel. That we're missing part of it. What would be considered missing something in the spine? That already we're going to say it's no longer mitame tumat mei. It's not going to have impurity of a dead body in a house. Beit Shammai omrim shte chuliot, two vertebrae. Ubeit Hillel omrim chulia achat. Beit Hillel says once it's missing one vertebrae, you notice here he's stringent. Once it's missing one vertebrae, it's already not considered a spine, and it will not create impurity in the house. Whereas Beit Shammai says until it's missing two, it's still considered a spine. Ubegulgolet, when it comes to the skull, Beit Shammai omrim kimelo makdeach, like a drill bit. Ubeit Hillel omrim kedei sheyinatel min achai v'yamot. It's not based on size; it's the amount that, or it's not a size of something in particular. It's the amount that if you took it out of, if that part was missing in the person's head, person's skull, when the person was alive, the person would not be able to survive. That's the amount. Some people say it's a smaller amount than Beit Shammai. Okay, so kind of like in the previous machloket, that it's smaller. Even a small amount will already make it a problem. Now, we haven't yet gotten to the contradiction. Now when it comes to the shidra and the gugolet, so already we have very clear, Beit Shammai says for a spine not to be complete, it has to be missing two. For a Beit Hillel, it's only one vertebrae. For the gulgolet, Beit Shammai says kimelo makdeach, and Beit Hillel says whatever would come out that would already mean the person, if the person was alive, he would now be dead if you would remove that. That's for tumat mei. Now, if we take that same machloket, they say va'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel v'chein le'inyan treifa. The same is true for what constitutes treifa in an animal. Treifa in an animal is an animal that basically would not have survived, according to the main opinion, we'll see this more when we get to chulin, would not have survived 12 months. And then there's a whole list of what makes something a treifa. So now there's a debate, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, the same issue. Is there a debate when it comes to a treifa? So now we're going to apply it, and we're going to see the stringencies there become leniencies here, and vice versa. So here you have, if an animal is missing two vertebrae in the spine, according to Beit Shammai, that makes the animal a treifa. According to Beit Hillel, it's only one. So at 1 already, it's going to be considered a treifa. So Beit Hillel is going to be more machmir, right? So he's going to say, sorry, lenient treifa, let me just get it straight. Beit Shammai says 2 chuliot are going to mean, right, according to Beit Shammai, maybe I said this the reverse before, you need 2 to be missing in the spine. Until 2 are missing, it's still going to be tamei mate. So when it comes to tamei mate, Beit Shammai is more stringent. When it comes to treifa, Beit Shammai is more lenient, because Beit Shammai is going to say you need to be missing 2 in order for it to be a treifa. If it's missing 1, that's not a treifa. So now if you take the stringencies of both, you're going to end up with something that totally contradicts, okay? And therefore, you're going to have a problem. So basically, again, let me just make it clear, because I think I said it the reverse before by accident, which is when it comes to Tumat Ohel, so Beit Shammai is the more right? Beit Shammai is the more lenient position, because he's the more machmir position, because he's saying you need a lot more to be missing in order to say this is not whole, right? You need more to be missing, which means it's going to be more stringent when it comes to Tumat Ohel. Until it's missing all those parts, everything in the Ohel is going to be tameh. When it comes to the treifa, he's going to end up being more lenient, okay? His position is more lenient. Sorry if I explained it the opposite before, but that's what it is. So now, if that's a case where you can't take the stringencies of both opinions, because then you're really haksil b'choshech holech. You're walking in the dark, you're making no sense. Either 2 vertebrae missing means it's no longer a spine, or it doesn't mean, right? Or there's 1. Either 1 means it's not a spine, or 1 is a spine. You can't say both. But in our case, there's no contradiction to say it's a mavoy mefulash and say that we're going to need a door. Those 2 don't contradict each other. It's just saying in one will hold like Rav and then the other will hold like Shmuel. So therefore, it's not an issue. However, Mativ Rab Misharshia, on this last part that we just said, that you can't hold by stringencies of both in a case where they're contradictory, we're going to have a problem, because we're going to see a case where someone held like the stringencies of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel in a way where they did contradict each other. What is this? Maaseh Rabbi Akiva shaliket etrog be'echad b'shvat v'nahag bo shnei isurim echad kedivrei Beit Shammai ve'echad kedivrei Beit Hillel. You need a little bit of background. We all know about Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is on what day of the month? Tu B'Shvat. It's on Tet Vav of Shvat, which means, what is Tu B'Shvat? It's the Rosh Hashanah Li'ilanot. It's when we determine the new year for trees. What does that mean, the new year for trees? It means that we have a set of years. There's 1 through 7 till we get to the Shemitah year. On years 1, 2, 4, and 5, we give what's called Maaser Ani. We give a 10th of the produce after we've taken out the Truma for the Kohen, the Maaser for the Levi. We then take Maaser for what we call Maaser Sheni, and it has to be brought to Yerushalayim. Usually they will redeem it on a coin, and they bring the coins to Yerushalayim and then buy fruits and vegetables or meat with that money. But on years number 3 and years number 6, they would give that same Maaser, a 10th, but to the poor people, Maaser Ani. So now the question is, when does the new year start? So there's a machloket Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel. It's kind of funny, you could say there's a machloket about Tu B'Shvat. It's not really about Tu B'Shvat, because Tu B'Shvat is obviously the 15th. But there's a machloket about when Rosh Hashanah Li'ilanot is. Is it on the 1st of Shvat, according to Beit Shammai? According to Beit Hillel, it's on the 15th. So that's why we know the 15th, Tu B'Shvat, because of Beit Hillel. But Beit Shammai held, no, it's on the 1st of Shvat. We're going to get to this in Masechet Rosh Hashanah more in depth. So there was a case where somebody picked an etrog, Rabbi Akiva picked an etrog on the 1st day of Shvat, which means, according to Beit Shammai, this was the new year, and it was a year, let's say it was the 3rd year, so it was basically the 2nd year going into the 3rd year. He said, well, if we hold like Beit Shammai, then I have to take Maaser Ani. If we hold like Beit Hillel, then I have to take Maaser Sheni. So what did he do? He took 2, just in case. So here, now that's obviously contradicting. Either it's the 3rd year or it's the 2nd year. It can't be both the 3rd year and the 2nd year. So he took 2 isurim. He maaser, 1 for Maaser Sheni and brought to Yerushalayim, and 1 he gave to poor people. So echad kedivrei Beit Shammai, echad kedivrei Beit Hillel. So here you see, contradicts, and yet he did it. So the Gemara answers and says, no, Rabbi Akiva Gemara is typically v'lo yada I Beit Hillel b'chad b'shvat amor, I b'chamisar b'shvat amor. It wasn't that he didn't know, he wanted to do like Beit Shammai and like Beit Hillel. That's not the situation. He wasn't sure what Beit Hillel's position was. And because he wasn't sure what Beit Hillel's position was, he said, let me be machmir. That's not the same as saying, I want to be machmir like both positions. He just wasn't sure what Beit Hillel held, and he said, I better be on the safe side, and I'm going to do like both. Then it's okay. Then he just didn't know what it was. Interesting to think that Rabbi Akiva didn't know Beit Hillel's position. But that's what they say, and that's our explanation, and therefore we're left with, again, we have our two potential answers. Going back to where we started, Mavoy Akum in Nahardea, they basically held like the Chumrah of Rav and the Chumrah de Shmuel. How could they have done that? Either we say, really, Rav himself held the more machmir position, or you can hold by two machmir positions as long as they don't contradict each other. And that's this case where they don't actually contradict each other. Okay, moving on. We're now going to have a situation where Rav Yosef teaches something in front of Rav Huna, in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav. And then he teaches something else in the name of Rav Yehuda, and we're going to try to establish, could what he said be like Rav, or is it clearly not like Rav? Okay, the first statement he said in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, the second one just in the name of Rav Yehuda, and we're going to try to compare it to some other case, and we're going to assume it's not like Rav, and then we're going to suggest that maybe it actually is like Rav, and that's going to take us to the end of today's talk. Yativ Rav Yosef Kimei Rav Huna, so he was sitting in front of Rav Huna, v'yativ v'kamal, and he sat and he said the following. So we gave two different halachot. The first one we're going to deal with pretty simply. The second one's going to be a little more complicated. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So the first thing he said was, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Machloket b'srake mikan u'srake mikan. U'plake mikan u'plake mikan. What's strata and platya? It's strata like a street, and a platya is a plaza. So a strata is basically opening up into the Reshut HaRabim, the public domain. And a platya is opening up into a plaza, like a shuk almost, right? So both of these are very public spaces. So when we talk about this whole thing about a mavoi mefulash and whether you need this whole machloket between them, do you need a door and a lechi and a korah, or do you need just a tzurat petach on one side and a lechi and a korah on the other, or lechi or korah? So that machloket is only if it's got a street on one side and a street on the other, or a plaza on one side and a plaza on the other, or it seems a strata on one and a plata on the other, platya, okay, all of those options. Aval, srate mikan ubik amikan, if you have a valley on the other side, basically meaning that on one side it opens to Reshut HaRabim, on the other side it's open to an area that leads to fields, which are not so common if there's lots of people walking through. If that's the case, we don't call it a mavoi mefulash. It might be open on both sides, but it has to be open on both sides to a very public space. If not, then what do they all agree? Now, pay attention. Okay, I'll read one more line first. Or bik'amikan u bik'amikan, or let's say it's a mavoi, an alley that opens on both sides to a big valley. Everyone agrees in that case that you still need a tzurat petach on one side. It's not enough to have a lechi or korah on either side, but nobody thinks you need a door there. Okay, the whole machloket, Rav and Shmuel, or Hananya, Tanakama, is all about when it's a big street on both sides. But if you have on one side or on both sides not being a big street, then it's enough to have a tzurat petach on one side, again, a beam going horizontally, and two posts going vertically on one side, and one of those on the other side. So first, the Gemara questions some line about this and says, wait a minute. Hashja strati mikanu bika mikanu selu tzurat petach mikan v'lechi v'korah mikan bika mikanu bika mikan mivbaya. How could you say you don't need that last case? If I say it's got a street on one side and a valley on the other, you don't need a door, right? Nobody thinks you need a door. Everybody agrees about it, tzurat petach. Then you for sure don't even need to tell me that when it comes to a bika on this side and a bika on that side, right? With both valley on both sides, of course you wouldn't need a door. So why are you even telling us this? So the answer, well, really, this is how you should read it. Hachi ka'amar, srati mikanu bika mikan, na'asa kebika mikanu bika mikan. If you have a street on one side and a bika on the other, it's like having a bika on both sides. I see someone wrote as a bika carmelite. A bika could be a carmelite. It could be kind of anything that's not a Reshut HaRabim, it's basically saying. Okay, as long as it's not a big public space where right, it doesn't have all the criteria of a Reshut HaRabim, then already we're not going to call this a mavoi mefulash. and it could still be called a mavoi mefulash, but there's no argument about needing a door. Nobody thinks, like Hananya in the name of Beit Hillel, that you would need a door. That was his first statement. That was fairly simple. The second one is going to be much more complicated. I'm going to also preface it by saying that I'm reading the Gemara the way Rashi reads it. There are other ways of reading this case, okay? I don't want to confuse too much, so I'm going to try, sometimes I'll bring you two different opinions about how to read it. Today I'm going to go with Rashi. Did I skip? No. Okay, so Umisayim, 4 lines from the bottom. So we started with Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna, and he taught the following halacha about the machloket about a mavoi mefulash, Hananya, Tanakama, and Rav and Shmuel is only when you have stratya, platya, but not with a bika on one side. But now he continues, Umasayim ba'mishmei de Rav Yehuda. Now notice he says the next halacha in the name of Rav Yehuda, but not who Rav Yehuda learned this from. If you remember, we've talked about it before. Rav Yehuda learned from Rav and from Shmuel. So right now he said it in the name of Rav Yehuda. And what he said is, and for this you'll need the pictures, Im hayam mavoi kalet lerechava, ein tzarich klum. So a few details about this case. So here's picture number 41 in the book, Hama'or HaMevu'al. So here we have a mavoi. Remember we talked about a mavoi has to be narrow, and it's narrow more than it's narrower on the entranceway and long. So you have this long alley that leads to a rechava. A rechava, Rashi explains, is a backyard space. Now, why is it important that it's a backyard space? According to Rashi, if you look at the very last line in Rashi on Zayin Amud Bet, he says, I'll just read it inside for a second. He says, "Berechava leika diurin lemisrei amavli." What's unique about a rechava? People don't hang out there. They don't live there. The chatzer, now it's interesting. We use our backyards generally, not everybody, but we use our backyards generally more than our front yards. But they, in those days, apparently used the front yard much more than the backyard. So the backyard wasn't so commonly used. So because of that, we're going to say, if your mavoi opens up to a rechava. Now the rechava, okay, so we have a rectangle that's narrow in the entranceway. That's the alley, a long alleyway that opens up into a wider, shorter, okay, now this is important, the direction. So we basically have it kind of hitting perpendicular to this rechava, to this backyard space. So if you see in the picture, for example, there's 2 chatzerot, 2 courtyards with 2 houses in each that open up. I feel like it's a game of Monopoly a little bit, right? Like houses and hotels, right? These look like the little Monopoly houses. So you have these 2 houses that open up each into this alleyway. And then you have a back space, which 2 houses open up into this back space, right? Their backyard opens up, but it's not a courtyard really. It's just a rechava. Now, if you notice in the back of that rechava in the picture number 41, there's an exit out the other side. So if you're standing at the front of the mavoi, you can see all the way to the other end out to the street. So this looks a little like a mavoi mefulash, except that it's not the mavoi that opens up into the back. It's this backyard space that people don't generally use. So therefore, comes Rav Yosef says in the name of Rav Yehuda, if the mavoi kalel rechava, if it ended in a rechava, it dumps out basically into this rechava. Ein tzarich klum. Meaning, what he means, ein tzarich klum means you still need to fix the mavoi. You need to do a lechi or a korah, right? And you put up your post or your beam in the front of the mavoi, but it's a mavoi satum. You don't need anything on the other side. And now remember, what do you need for a mavoi to fix it? You need, number 1, either a lechi or a korah, assuming it's closed on 3 sides. And you need food. You need all the people to do an Eruv together. So what they say here is, you don't need anything. And what we're going to learn is, well, maybe I'll hold off on the Eruv part. But right now, basically what it means is, we view this as if it has 3 closed walls, even though the wall in the back is open. So you don't need anything on that back wall. So Amar le Abai le Rav Yosef, Abai says to Rav Yosef, Hadi Rav Yehuda de Shmuel hi. That statement of Rav Yehuda must be said in the name of Shmuel and not in the name of Rav. Why? De'i de Rav, kashe de Rav de Rav betarti. Because if you hold like Rav, this is going to create a difficulty for Rav on 2 counts. Now, the 2, some people have a girsa that doesn't say 2 because it seems like it's only 1. Some people claim that, the second problem is going to come up in the next stuff, so we'll hold off on that for now. We're really going to see 1 contradiction right now. De Amar Rav Yomi Arba Arba Amar Rav. So Rav Yomi Arba Arba says in the name of Rav, Mavoi shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer. Now notice here, there's a bit of a change. And that's going to be in the answer. Right now, we're going to think that a rechava and a chatzer are the same. Chatzer means a courtyard. Rechava, we're explaining to mean a backyard. But right now, let's assume it's the same. So mavoi shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer. V'nifratza chatzer kenegdo, chatzer muteret umavoi asur. So again, it sounds like the same thing. And look at picture number 42. So it's basically the same thing. It's just instead of it opening up into a rechava, backyard, it's opening up into a front yard, a chatzer, a courtyard of houses. So again, the mavoi is nifratz. What does it say? Bimlo'o. What does it mean, bimlo'o? This is very important. When you look from the mavoi to the chatzer, you see no walls, correct? When you look, the only wall you see is the wall on the far side of the courtyard. But when you're crossing over in the picture, you can really see the difference on the ground between the mavoi and the chatzer because they colored it in different colors. But if you're walking in, there's no wall or barrier that's blocking you because you're walking into a space that's wider than the space that you're in. You're in this narrow alley and it opens up into a wider space. The only wall you see is on the far side. So basically, because it's nifratz bimlo o lachatzer, so he says, Rav says, and nifratza chatzer kenegdo, if there's an opening in the chatzer on the other side. Now, how much of an opening? We're talking about less than 10 amot. Okay, because remember, the mavoi entrance is also less than 10 amot. Remember, if it's wider, you have to close it in a little. A less than 10 opening is going to basically be, that should be a mavoi mefulash, basically, because you have your chatzer and you have an opening to, your entrance to the mavoi on one side, and on the other side, you have an exit from the chatzer. Now, according to what we just said, if it opens to a backyard and there's an open space, it's not considered a mavoi mefulash. So what Abaye claims is that Rav Yosef said the name of Rav Yehuda must not be in the name of Rav, because he says v'amai lehave kemavoi shekalei lerechava. There should be no difference between a mavoi that opens up into a chatzer and a mavoi that opens up into a rechava. If the mavoi opens up into one of these spaces and there's an opening on the other side, according to Abaye, he looks at these cases as if they're both the same, which means if Rav said that opening up into a courtyard, which opens up into the public, will be considered a mavoi mefulash, an open mavoi, then he assumes that Rav would say the same thing by a rechava, by a backyard. Okay, that's his assumption. So the first response we have is Rav Yosef's response. Rav Yosef says, Amar le, ana lo yadana. I really don't know. Honestly, Rav Yehuda told it to me. He didn't tell me if it was Rav, if it was Shmuel. All I know is this. Uvdahava bedura de reuta. There was a case that happened in a village of roim, of shepherds. Mavoi shakalele rechavahava. There was a case where the mavoi ended in a backyard space. Va'ata lekamei de Rav Yehuda v'lo itzrachei v'lo midi. And he didn't require anything. V'ikasha mishmei de Rav. And if you want to say, look, Rav Yehuda doesn't seem to fit with what Rav said, he says, Tahavi mishmei de Shmuel v'lo kasha midi. So then I'll say, fine, it goes like Shmuel. In other words, this is what I know. What I know is what I saw happen. I saw it with my own eyes. Rav Yehuda said, this is okay. You don't need, it's not treated like a mavoi mefulash. Basically, you don't need anything on the other side where the rechava went out into the street. He didn't require any sort of fixing there. All he put up was a lechi or a korah on the other side. And obviously, there must have been some sort of Eruv. We'll talk about the Eruv in a minute, right? Meaning food. The people in the chatzerot had to be together. But it seems like the people in the rechava didn't need to be part of the Eruv, okay? Because that's a space that isn't designated for people walking around, and therefore that they didn't even need to be part of the Eruv. And that doesn't mess up. The whole idea is if people aren't together for food, then it means you're not all together, and then you can't carry in the mavoi, even if you put up a lechi or a korah. You need both things. But here, he didn't require it, and basically Rav Yosef says, look, I don't know if he held like Rav or not, but if you want to say that's difficult, fine, I'll say he held like Shmuel, and that's fine. But now the Gemara suggests maybe he did hold like Rav, and maybe there's a distinction between the mavoi, the rechava to the chatzer. A backyard is not the same as a front yard. So the Gemara says, Hashta da'amar le Rav Sheshet le Rav Shmuel bar Abba. They're now going to bring in something somebody else said about the case of the chatzer. Rav Sheshet said either to Rav Shmuel bar Abba, va'amri le Rav Yosef bar Abba. Either he said it to Rav Shmuel bar Abba or Rav Yosef bar Abba. They were confused which brother, I guess it was. They were brothers. As beralach, kan she'irvu, kan shelo irvu. The case of the chatzer really depends on whether they did an Eruv or whether they didn't do an Eruv. And now we're going to learn that whether you can fix this mavoi or not doesn't have to do with, is it a mavoi mefulash or not? It has to do with, can you even carry, because to the people in the Chatzer, let's assume the people in the Chatzer didn't make an Eruv. Remember we said there were 3 courtyards here. So let's say the 2 people in the front, the 2 courtyards, they made an Eruv together with the mavoi. And then there's this back space which wasn't part of the Eruv. So if they didn't do an Eruv, then what happens? So something interesting happens here. First, it's obvious that you can't carry in the mavoi, because if you remember, we said not only can you not move, right? You can't, the whole issue in a mavoi, you can't even carry 4 amot in a mavoi. We treat it like a rishut rabim because it leads to the rishut rabim, mita rabbanan. So now, this is what we call, it's something shenifratz bimlo'o l'reshut asura alav. Okay, this is a mavoi, which is open entirely. Remember we said, when you're in the mavoi, it's totally open to the courtyard. You can't see any walls or anything. There's no barrier. So when you walk into that courtyard, you're going into a space where the people in the mavoi are not allowed to carry there because those people didn't join the Eruv. So that means they're saying our space is distinct from your space. If our space is distinct from your space, we can't carry from one to the other, which means that you can't fix the whole mavoi because you have people there, right? The mavoi can't carry into the Chatzer. Theoretically, I think the people in the front part of the mavoi can carry there, but the people in the mavoi can't carry into the back space, okay? It's now forbidden to go into that back space. And because of that, right, that's what we call, it's parutz bimlo'o to that space. However, the Chatzer people, and this we're going to see more tomorrow, because the Chatzer is wider, and this is why the picture is very important. If you look at the picture, the people in the courtyard, when they're looking into the mavoi, they have a wall. Because remember, there's right a long rectangle of the alley going into this very wide rectangle, and all they have is a less than 10 amma opening to the mavoi, and a less than 10 cubit opening to the reshut rabim, which we call those, right? As long as it's less than 10, what do we call it? A petach, not a pirza. So they actually have walls all around them. So in the Chatzer, they're allowed to carry. So that's what he says. Basically, if you remember before, what did we say? Chatzer, going back to the beginning, Rav had said, Mavoi shenifratz bimlo'o lechatzer, v'nifratza chatzer kenegdo, right? There's an opening from the mavoi to the Chatzer, and from the Chatzer to the reshut rabim. Chatzer muteret u'mavoi asur. One can carry within that courtyard, meaning all the people in the houses can carry, let's say they did their own Eruv Chatzerot. That's why there's a difference. I mentioned this in the introduction, but now you'll see it really. Difference between Eruv Chatzerot and Shitufei Mevo'ot. Okay? They did an Eruv of the people within their courtyard, but they didn't do a Shituf Mevo'ot with all the other courtyards in the Mavoi. Okay? So they can carry within their Chatzer because there's walls, and they call them Gidudim. Okay, they can see walls, so they see their space is distinct. Whereas when the mavoi leads into the Chatzer, there's no walls at all. There's nothing to notice it by, and therefore the mavoi can't go into there, which means that this doesn't have to do with is it a mavoi mefulash or not. When it says mavoi asur, it means you can't fix this mavoi. You can't allow carrying this mavoi because it's open to a space that's forbidden to it. So carrying the mavoi is forbidden. So now let's read this again. So Rav Yosef Bar Abba says, Ezbaralach, kan she'irvu, kan shelo irvu. There's different situations here of this Chatzer case. Even though we quoted in the name of Rav, that Mavoi shenifratz b'mlo'o lechatzer, v'nifratza Chatzer kenegdo Chatzer muteret u'mavoi asur, that's only if they didn't do an Eruv, if the people in the Chatzer didn't do an Eruv. But if the people in the Chatzer did an Eruv with the rest of the people in the Mavoi, then it would be allowed. Okay, that's the first thing you have to understand. So if you got that, then we're going to move on to the next step. So that means basically, once you do that, we don't care about the opening on the other side because that's just a petach. That's like what we saw the other day, which is if you have a mavoi with 3 walls and there's an opening of up to 10 amot on one of the walls, that's just an opening and that doesn't cancel your ability to fix your mavoi putting up a lechi or a korah. So if you have an Eruv between, if the back Chatzer has an Eruv with the people in the rest of the mavoi, and you put up a lechi or korah on the front of that mavoi, that's totally fine, no problem. So once we say that, then we can say derava derav nami lo kashya. Then Rav's ruling about the Chatzer doesn't contradict what Rav Yosef said in the name of Rav Yehuda about the Rechava. Why is that? So again, this is where Rashi is a little bit weak, okay? A weakness in Rashi. I always say that if it was so obvious, then there wouldn't be a machloket about how to read this. But like I said, I'm reading Rashi's reading. Kan she'irvu b'nei chatzer and b'nei mavoy, kan shelo irvu. We'll say the same thing by the Rechava, but here it's a little tricky because it seems to be saying it depends whether you made an Eruv or not, but that's not what Rashi says. What Rashi says is what we said before. A Rechava is different. Why is a Rechava different? Because it's not generally used. People don't use it for living. That's why I quoted Rashi here, but Rechava leika diurin. Basically, we can say that when he ruled in that the Rechava is equivalent to a Chatzer with an Eruv, because you don't need an Eruv there at all. Let's say the people in the front two courtyards made a shituf mavot with each other, and yet there was the space in the back of the Rechava, and the two people in those houses didn't, right? Now, those two houses, think about it. Their backyard opens up into the courtyard, which leads into their backyard opens up into the alley, but their front yards go straight to the street. So because of that, and they don't really use the space in their backyard, that space, by the way, this might be similar to us. I said we use our backyards more, but what do I mean here? We don't go out our houses through the backyards, right? We use it for our own personal space, but we don't. So therefore, that space doesn't matter. If they didn't do an Eruv with us, we don't care because their space doesn't open up into our mavoy. So when they leave their houses, they're not leaving through the mavoy, they're leaving through the sides. So therefore, that is equivalent, and even Rav, since Rav in the Chatzer case distinguishes between whether they did an Eruv or whether they didn't, and if they did an Eruv, it's no problem. So this wouldn't be a case of what we said before, that the mavoy nifratz bekulo l'reshuta asura alav, it's not a reshuta asura alav, because the Rechava is not a forbidden space to the mavoy, which means that this mavoy, you can fix it and you can ignore the backspace. The backspace doesn't bother us, and for sure, there's two things. One is we don't have to worry about the opening in the backspace. That doesn't make it a vamoy v'fulash. And number two, we don't need to worry about the fact that we have people that didn't join the Eruv because they don't need an Eruv at all. So here's a weakness in Rashi because it seems to say, same here, we'll say either they made an Eruv or they didn't make an Eruv. What Rashi means is, well, it's like the case where they made an Eruv because they don't even need an Eruv. Okay, that's the weakness in Rashi because it sounds like they would need to make an Eruv, but it's not the way Rashi explains it. Rashi explains they don't even need an Eruv. It would be that same distinction, and this would fall into that category, and therefore it's not a contradiction. So we're going to stop here for today as the daf stops here. Tomorrow we're going to continue on, and the first question of the Gemara is going to be, what were they thinking in the first place? In other words, we've rejected what we thought in the first place, but now they want to know what was your thinking and thinking this wasn't like Rav, and then they're going to go more into detail into the case. Okay, have a good day. Shavua Tov, everybody. We'll end here.